Welcome to the future of Chicago work. My name is Max Japovsky. I help companies around the country find and negotiate the leases for their office space, ensuring the space they have is a space they need and reflects and supports their company culture. The Future of Work is a series exploring our evolving relationship with work, the how, where, and why, the trends and technologies disrupting and improving the workplace, and perspectives from thought leaders on our new normal. On January 13th, 2020, a flight from China landed in Chicago. Among the passengers on board, a woman in her 60s who a week and a half later would be admitted to the hospital with shortness of breath and a fever. She would become the second confirmed case of COVID-19 infection in the United States. Meanwhile, at City Hall, Samir Mayekar was 8 months into his first year as deputy mayor with the Lightfoot administration, spending his time on initiatives like the recently launched Invest Southwest and bringing his entrepreneurial optimism to adding jobs and investing in underserved communities across the city. Unemployment was at 3.5%, and the federal funds rate was around 1.5%. In the commercial real estate world, Chicago had just wrapped its strongest leasing activity year of the decade with over 10 million square feet of new leases recorded for the year. Rental rates were hovering near record highs, the vacancy rate near record lows, available sublease space was less than 1% of the total inventory, and projects comprising over 7 million square feet of office space were under construction. And most people were in the office 5 days a week. Boy, were we in for a ride. Over the next few months, our lives as we knew them would pause. Construction on countless projects would stop, offices would close, unemployment would skyrocket, and we would find ourselves with more questions than answers. But as we sat at our kitchen tables with our remote learning kids jumping into our conference calls, we started to collectively rethink our relationship with work. This would have massive implications that are still playing out across our personal and professional lives. But that would come later. In the early days of the pandemic, amid the shell shock, Samir and his team went to work, at least metaphorically. They rolled up their sleeves and, amid the confusion, began to craft a COVID response plan that would put Chicago back on solid footing. As the plan was being implemented, social unrest rocked our city, and as companies reevaluated the role of their offices and moved into newer buildings, landlords began to buckle under the weight of the increasing vacancies. For Samir and his team, it was fighting off the back foot, but nothing he wasn't used to. As the co-founder and CEO of Nanograph, Samir has spent time in the crucible of the startup world, and as director of national security personnel in the Obama White House, among others, he served in the considerably hotter crucible of the public sector. It has been a hell of a ride, but today Samir's here to share those plans created in 2020 and continuously revised and improved are, although not without challenges, starting to bear fruit. Samir, welcome.
Thanks, Max. That was a wonderful intro. I'm thinking back now to where we were in the early days of COVID and how long that journey has been.
It seems like a different lifetime, huh?
Oh my gosh. Well, I will tell you, we were in work. The whole team here, we were basically coming in the office throughout the whole pandemic, given the nature of the work we do here in the city. And I think the most stark moment I had was when we were basically deployed to McCormick Place. And we turned it into an alternate care facility. And the mayor kind of said, look, you built a company, go figure out how to, the next startup here is to get a field hospital in place in 10 and a half days. And we did it.
I remember that. That was wild. So talk a little bit about your role and your current priorities.
Well, so my role as deputy mayor for economic development is to focus on making sure we have a thriving downtown, but also that the prosperity extends to the neighborhoods and that we have a concerted effort to focus on neighborhood investment, especially in the neighborhoods that have been disinvested for too long. So my priorities are the priorities of my boss, Mayor Lightfoot. And, I was an early supporter of hers when I was CEO of my company. I came in and co-chaired her transition, and I'm very proudly have been here in this role with her since day one. And the priorities from when she came in till now, even though we had a pandemic, they're largely the same. We got to make sure that we're on a path to being the safest big city in America. We need to focus on deeper investment on the south and the west side. We need to structurally reform so many processes in the city, including our finances. And we need to build a city that our youth see themselves in and where they see opportunity. So despite having the pandemic, in many ways, the pandemic has made all of those priorities all the more important.
Totally, like an accelerant.
Mm-hmm.
So you talked a lot about a strong downtown supported by thriving neighborhoods. Describe what that means.
What's interesting, that probably meant something slightly different before the pandemic than it does now. And one of the things I keep thinking about is from my startup days, I learned how important the number one trait of successful entrepreneurial leaders is, and it's learning agility. And so truly COVID has tested us with that skill, and I'm proud that we've actually been a fairly entrepreneurial government. But when you think about a strong downtown and thriving neighborhoods, today what that means is that downtown can't be a monoculture. You can no longer have just an office district with a single use that's highly busy from 9 to 5 and then very quiet in the other hours. So the goal is the same way that we're thinking about a 15-minute neighborhood having amenities all throughout the South and the West Side, the same way you have amenities in the West Loop or the North Side. Downtown, we've had the fastest growing residential downtown of any city in the country. We've gained over 100,000 residents in the past 20 years. But there are still parts of downtown, like you think of LaSalle Street, where you have almost an office monoculture. So a thriving downtown has to continue to increase the mixed use, and that includes having more residential where you have streets that are vibrant around the clock. And we have work to do, which is, I know we'll get into this more, but I think that's going to be the biggest change, coming after COVID, where those were already issues pre-COVID. And like an accelerant, we have to absolutely tackle them right now.
100%. So unlike City Hall, most of Chicago was effectively shut down in May of 2020 as lockdowns were implemented. What did that do to your priorities at the time? Did it reshuffle them at all? Did it force you to look at things differently or revise any of your plans? What did that look like?
Well, the first thing I'll mention is, if you remember those early days, there was a deep amount of work between our team and, of course, the state to make sure that the right exemptions were granted to keep the right industries open so society could function and so that we could stay healthy. We were one of the only big cities that kept construction activity going through the pandemic. And that became very important because if you think of a city like New York, they actually stopped construction. And then, they felt it on the other side when they were trying to recover, getting folks back to work. It took some time to ramp up. We never had that issue. So, I think the way in which we handled some of those early months helped shape the trajectory of the recovery. And we've had a very strong economic recovery. But the priorities that we had, if anything, we had to double down on those priorities. If you think of the challenges of making sure the city's safe, if you think of the challenges of neighborhood investment, the same neighborhoods hit the hardest by COVID were the ones where you saw the most disinvestment, in the decades before COVID. So we had to stack on all of this COVID management on top of what was already our core management priorities that I, had covered earlier.
That's a full plate. As the city was recovering from COVID, how did this strategy keep neighborhood development in mind while still continuing to focus on the operation and addressing the, at the time, continuously increasing COVID cases?
Well, so, I guess you could call this a startup CEO in me. My philosophy on how to manage this was to build separate teams to handle these initiatives. So, a program like Invest Southwest that is a top priority for the mayor and, needed to make a lot of progress despite the pandemic. We had a team of really talented people helping to implement that program. And they were, somewhat firewalled from this team that was handling the day-to-day crisis of the day, COVID core management. Of course, they were all, talking with each other. But one of the reasons why we were able to make progress on these core priorities through the pandemic is because from a management perspective, we built the organization to be able to do that. And I think that was very important. And when you talk about learning agility, to me, it was making sure that we had an adequate amount of focus, yes, on the crisis at hand, but yes, also on the long-term priorities, because you have to do both. I think you probably know any good entrepreneur always has that chart on their wall about doing what's important and not important versus what's urgent and not urgent. And too often in government, you can fall into that bucket of doing what's kind of less important but absolutely urgent at the expense of those long-term priorities. And I think that startup philosophy in me made sure we had teams doing both.
Yeah. The 7 habits of highly successful people. What's interesting though is if you look at what was happening then, addressing COVID and responding to it is about as urgent as you can imagine. So being able to still continue work on the important initiatives that aren't as life or death urgent as COVID is really a testament to the administration. So multiple surveys have shown that we're definitely not going back to a 5 days in the office work week. But restaurants, other retail businesses that are based in the Loop, which for the most part is commercial, right, not residential, they already had to survive on 5 days a week of revenue. I can't imagine them surviving on 3 days a week of revenue. So you have to bring people back to city streets, definitely Monday and Friday, to help bring some of that activity, some of that spending back to the city. How do you do that? And is there anything you can do to help companies encourage their people to come back?
So let's start with, I think, an interesting statistic. I'm a data person, and what most people in the city don't always recognize is when I ask, hey, what percentage do you think of our workforce in Chicago can work on Zoom? Any guess on your end?
What they say or what actually has been
What
shown?
you think the actual number is?
25%?
You're actually dead on. It's 30%. So that means 70% of workers in Chicago do not have the ability or luxury to be able to hop on a virtual meeting in their living room. And I think it's important that we all put that in perspective.
Yeah.
And so you're asking the right question. There's a few pillars that I would say that we've had to think through as we focus on the core issue that you're addressing, which is like, how do we recover?
Yeah.
And I think I've always said don't come to my office with 2019 thinking. That's why I always tell the team, we can't just say, okay, let's just go back to how things were. And at the same time, we can't assume that the behaviors that we've adopted during COVID are also going to be the right behaviors, in perpetuity. So what are we doing? First, experiences. Experiences matter. People in this city, in the country, in the world, they crave experiences right now.
Yeah.
And in that front, you think about what the city's been able to do. We helped incentivize and fund, in many instances, very new experiences. You think about Sundays on State, that brought 100,000 people every Sunday to State Street, which was pedestrianized. Their foot traffic actually surpassed 2019 on those days. So that's a good example. You think about bringing the first ever street course for NASCAR to Chicago. That's a very unique experience. Extending Lollapalooza, for another 10 years. The new Sueños Festival that just announced their lineup yesterday. Largest ever reggaeton festival in North America. That was new coming out of the pandemic. So experiences are going to be critical because that's where we're seeing demand. Now, second pillar is really recognizing whatever this new normal is and adapting to it. So in the hospitality sector downtown, actually many of the restaurants are overperforming where they were in 2019. It just means that the pattern of consumption is different. Some of the hours are operating earlier. They're busier, of course, in the middle of the week. They're very busy on the weekends, so they're changing their staffing accordingly. So we're optimistic. I mean, I will say over the course of the summer, we were pretty comparable to 2019 levels of hotel occupancy and our visitation and tourists that they're starting to come back. So I think that there's just a shift in how these hospitality operations are able to manage, knowing that they went through hell during COVID.
Yeah.
And they really got hammered. So we're encouraged by what we see. Now, the last bit of this is the office. And, we were talking about this earlier. So I am of the opinion that for most offices, clearly the pure 5-day, every day come to work. That's what I do, but I know that that's not what, most offices are doing. So I think whoever masters the hybrid workspace, and whether that's 3 or 4 days in and having some flexible policy for those who can do it, that those organizations will ultimately be successful. What I hope we migrate away from is pure laissez-faire, and I think, oftentimes leaders expecting kind of their people to figure it out versus a purposeful act by a CEO. And in the height of the Great Resignation, I think a lot of corporate leaders in Chicago were looking at each other, who's going to make the first move. But I do think that ultimately culture matters, especially for innovation. And so it's important that leaders put a stake in the ground and say, here's what we need to do. And so I've, in the city here, for the workers who are able to work more flexibly, we have a 4-in-1 policy, and that was a purposeful act, by leadership here, and I think it's worked.
Is it a consistent 4 for everybody?
No.
So then how do you make sure that the right people are in at the same time?
And that is where I will be honest, you still have some growing pains, but for the most part, people have been able to figure out the rhythm of their team in a way that is, I think, respectful of their peers. So if there's set team meetings on certain days, we have those conversations around these are the days that are, more prone for you to remote work. And in some instances, 2 days ago it was pretty cold outside. So people might use their remote day on that day because there's a lot of snow on the ground and it's really cold.
Yep. So kind of a overarching philosophy that's flexible.
I think that's right, but flexible with purpose, not flexible for the sake of flexibility.
I like that. Okay. You talk about neighborhoods around a strong downtown. But when you think about the role of neighborhoods supporting a strong downtown, what I'm curious about is how do you avoid a zero-sum game? If you want to have those strong neighborhoods, those people can't be in 2 places at once. And so then would places like the CBD or specifically LaSalle Street start to suffer a little bit? So how do you do that?
So there's, I think, a core issue in Chicago is for too long we've always thought that somehow growing downtown and having a healthy, vibrant downtown must come at the expense of the neighborhoods. And what this administration under Mayor Lightfoot's leadership has really tried to prove is you can do both, right? We can have Google making the biggest corporate announcement of expansion in modern Chicago history, have Kellogg, Kimberly-Clark moving into the Central Business District and moving their headquarters here, while also having Invest Southwest, getting $2 billion of investment commitments on the south and the west side. You can do both. The key behind these policies is we have to have net regional growth. So the population of Chicago through the pandemic, and if you look at the last census, the population's increasing. That's key to not having this zero-sum game. We have to keep attracting people to our city and use our advantages of affordability, of infrastructure, and our talent base in order to keep growing. If we do that, then there won't be this trade-off. So ultimately, we need to densify neighborhoods that have space, and you're seeing that with Invest Southwest, while also bringing new types of visitors to downtown, where previously, I think, downtown didn't always feel welcome to all. And if you think of Sundays on State as an example, they brought 90% of their vendors were women or people of color. And the visitorship, therefore, was from all around the city, and it was super diverse. So there's a recipe here where the city comes out of this pandemic stronger because more people feel included downtown, but also neighborhoods that had suffered for 50 years come out on a better trajectory of growth.
So when you have companies that are considering Chicago, right? And Google aside, although that is a fantastic, fantastic piece of news that I think is going to help to catalyze the revitalization of at least the immediate surrounding area. What makes the news, I think the ideal PR story is a huge headquarters relocation that brings with it hundreds of thousands of jobs. But in today's world, in the new normal, oftentimes it could be a large company that's considering a small footprint, a company that's remote first or hybrid first. How do you sell Chicago to those companies that aren't promising you a big headquarters? They're just saying, hey, we're thinking about maybe putting a dozen people in a co-working space, but this will be our first presence in Chicago.
So I'll start with one statistic. Over the course of the past 2 years, we've had over 300 companies make pro-Chicago decisions. And that means that over 300 companies, despite the pandemic, expanded here or chose to relocate here. And sometimes that's counter to what I think people just perceive based on what they read in the media. But even just last year, 180 companies, that were making pro-Chicago decisions. That's 120 expansions, 45 new locations here in the city, and 27 were in the south and the west side. So the days, I think, of just solely focusing on headquarter hunting, headquarters are important for the brand. They're important for how the media covers a city. But at the end of the day, if you have a company with 100,000 people and they have 200 people in their headquarters here in the city, I can understand, of course, perception-wise why that's important. But really what we want is massive job creation and economic growth. And so I think, Michael, my colleague who runs World Business Chicago, we really try and make sure we're doing exactly what you're saying, is focusing on those companies who are on their growth trajectory to maximize employment here. And to your question about what's the pitch, well, as a former CEO, I grew my company here for a reason. I built it on the south side. But the pitch now is interesting. And this is similar to why Google said they wanted to expand here. First is this is where you have very amazingly diverse talent. So between our educational institutions, the talent base of the city, we have one of the most diverse talent pools in the entire country, 200,000 students here in the city. That's the bread and butter. Secondly, infrastructure. So, we're one of the only major cities where you can get on our trains and go to both airports. You can't do that in New York. So infrastructure does matter. And the infrastructure of this city was actually built for a slightly higher population. So we can absorb more people. The next two pitches for the city are new. One is values. And if you think about what's been going on with the overturn of Roe v. Wade, and if you just look at what's kind of the debate going on in Florida right now, about educational curriculum, this is a welcoming city where we want you to live your life the way you want to live it, and we will be welcoming to everyone. And increasingly that matters, especially when we're pitching companies in Europe for their new base of operations. They're saying, the whole Florida, Texas thing, this is not aligned with our values. And they're increasingly looking at cities like Chicago. And the final pitch is climate resiliency. We are in the most climate resilient part of the entire country. And we have bountiful sources of natural resources, but especially fresh water. And so long-term, for companies making very long-term decisions, those are some of the reasons, values, the climate resiliency, but most importantly, the infrastructure and the talent. That's why we still have a growing corporate base here in Chicago.
The water comment is interesting. I remember Mayor Lightfoot's predecessor, Rahm Emanuel, talking about how water is going to become one of the most valuable resources in the future, and your proximity to fresh water, being able to, the ease with which you can get it, is going to play a big factor in the appeal of your city. Now, if you think about a couple of the things that you mentioned, parts of the pitch, components of the pitch to Chicago, somebody could say, okay, well, the coasts have access to talent. They have similar approaches to come as you are, and we will accept you for who you are. And so with that in mind, what are some of the challenges that you've had in creating some of this job growth and then being able to kind of move forward with some of the neighborhood development?
Well, what I'll say is the tiebreaker, if you will, with the coast. First of all, the infrastructure, especially with the West Coast here, is on a different playing field, but the affordability. I mean, ultimately, the fact that you can afford to live in this city and still have all these world-class amenities, that is one of the reasons why we didn't see this exodus of population during the pandemic, the way that some of these peer coastal cities absolutely saw. I mean, what's interesting is if you look at the data in New York right now, and I got a lot of respect for New York. I love that city, but they've been losing a lot of middle-class residents, and that's an issue. But we haven't had that same issue because you can afford to live here and build your life here. So the challenges. Well, one of the key challenges, and this is going back to when I started my company, we were very much underperforming in venture capital in our ecosystem. I think we were 10th in the country back when I started my company about 12, 13 years ago. And through the pandemic, it's interesting, we actually topped Seattle and became fourth in terms of total growth and venture capital raised in Chicago. And one of the reasons for that is we put out this recovery plan back in the summer of 2020. And it was the first major recovery plan published by any city in the country. And I'm really proud of that. And what the plan said is, here are the sectors where we have a right to win, where we're going to see a growth coming out of COVID. Transportation and logistics tech, food and agriculture, manufacturing, life sciences. And so we tripled down our efforts to recruit companies and build our incentives around those industries. And that's where we've seen tremendous growth. I mean, you've probably interviewed so many people, and in the real estate market, you've seen the huge uptake in logistics tech companies. I mean, just look at Uber Freight's presence in the old post office, and they relocated here from San Francisco. So I think part of our challenge was that if you go after every type of industry, you're not going to be successful. But by focusing our recruitment efforts in the industries where we know we have a solid base of assets here, that's where we can win.
Yeah, and it's interesting because life sciences in particular, to take nothing away from the other industries you mentioned, which definitely we are uniquely positioned to serve, is there's such a shortage of office space for life sciences companies here that we can double or triple what exists and it would be filled. So I think that's fantastic.
Well, just right now, we have over 5 million square feet of life science space under development. We need to have more, and we're working on that. But when I started my company, we're a material science company. We built this company in a lab. There were 2 places in the city that you could go, and they weren't, they were good, but not great.
Right.
Now you look at the ecosystem, and there's multiple new buildings, from the West Loop to the old Lurie's to Lincoln Yards. You have Illinois Tech on the south side. University of Chicago's taking steps in this direction. So completely different ecosystem for lab space.
Totally. And I think it's a great area of growth. So some neighborhoods, let's talk about real estate for a little bit. Some neighborhoods, like Fulton Market, they thrived during the pandemic and was probably the basis for your earlier comment that we had one of the fastest growing downtowns in terms of at least the amount of office space under construction. Some, like the LaSalle corridor, had the double whammy of, decreased demand due to hybrid work and remote work and tenant relocations to newer buildings, right? And newer neighborhoods. So I had Andy Glure on the show a while back, and he talked about building destinations. And I think the difference between Fulton and LaSalle is the existing buildings in that LaSalle Street corridor. A lot of them were built before World War II. And those buildings are just hard to retrofit. Thompson Center is going to be hard enough to retrofit, and that's a newer building, right? And it has an existing tenant that's ready to take all of it. So a residential use also assumes that people would want to be kind of in that LaSalle Street canyon, so to speak. So I think that LaSalle Street Reimagined is an incredibly ambitious project. And of course, it's intended to mitigate some of the impact of those company relocations and the hybrid work movement. Talk to me about that initiative and, in an ideal world, the effects that it could have on the greater CBD.
So the biggest challenge of central business districts across the country is in Class B. right? There's a flight to quality. If you have a Class A space, you're in Fulton Market, you're leasing. And it's that Class B space who might have had some challenges pre-pandemic. This trend was existing on LaSalle, before COVID, and now it's a huge issue. Huge vacancy rates. So we've very quickly identified this in our recovery plan, saying this is an issue we need to focus on. So this LaSalle Street reimagined initiative effectively was a call for proposals to say, developers, come with your best proposals, and we have a fleet of incentives from landmarking to tax increment financing to affordable housing initiatives and so on to help redevelop these largely Class B office spaces from the Depression era into a more mixed-use district. What's interesting about LaSalle Street is you talked about Fulton Market, and it's the character of Fulton Market that really has helped distinguish it. But it's also the fact that you have world-class restaurants, you have thousands of new condos and apartment buildings under construction and occupied, and you have offices, and they all commingle. On LaSalle Street, the asset base there is actually even deeper than Fulton. First, it's 100 out of 100 transit score. It's the most transit-connected part of the city. Second, the good thing about those Depression-era buildings, they're built really well. So they're beautiful buildings. They just need some attention. The third thing is something that most people don't recognize. When we did an asset audit there on the corridor, there are beautiful destinations in LaSalle Street. If you go to the Rookery, and all these interior parts of these buildings are some of the most iconic, spectacular, beautiful, building amenities anywhere in the country. But no one knows about them, and people aren't visiting them. So we have to somehow unlock these hundreds of thousands of square feet of inner atrium space like the Rookery to create a new amenity set and also add grocer, add hospitality amenities, food and beverage, activate the street in a new way while building very nice places to live with a twist of making sure that there's equity in there and that we have affordable housing on that corridor for the first time. And so what's interesting to me is seeing, despite where interest rates are, despite where the market is, we had over $1 billion of proposals for 6 or 7 buildings, and the team is working hard on kind of evaluating that, and we'll make some announcements in the coming months, but we're going to get going on some of these projects, and you'll have actual neighborhood businesses coming downtown for the first time to set up shop. You'll have these landmark buildings get the attention they deserve, and you'll have a mixed-use district with thousands of more residential units, and 30% of them will be affordable. So I just think I'm so bullish on LaSalle, not only because you have Google as an anchor tenant, and yes, we're here too as City Hall and state government too. But the amenity set that people don't know about in these beautiful buildings is going to get just unlocked.
I think one of the most important skill sets that you and the rest of the administration has to have and looks like is storytelling. It's just a matter of reframing the narrative of what LaSalle Street, of the potential of LaSalle Street, right? So I think it's fascinating. Of course, the incentives are going to be doing their job, which is why you got over $1 billion of proposals.
That's right. And what's funny about that street, I think I also took my wedding pictures there. Did you take your wedding pictures there?
No, we took them in the city.
Yeah, I mean, it's like people go to the Kinsey Bridge, they go around the beaches, they'll go to LaSalle, and it's kind of what's funny about it is we want people to keep taking their wedding pictures there on the street. It's iconic. But part of the reason they do is because after 5 o'clock, there's nothing going on.
100%.
And so, that does need to change. But the mere fact that it's that iconic of a landscape is going to mean that people are going to want to be there.
There's probably a reason that The Dark Knight was filmed on Lower Wacker and LaSalle, right?
Correct.
You don't get something that looks so iconic without it being a location.
Well, and there's one residential building that actually opened during, I remember going to the ribbon cutting of it during the height of the pandemic, fully leased.
Unbelievable. So speaking of leases, how are you leveraging the Google lease for the Thompson Center to sort of maximize the impact for on the surrounding area? And what I mean by that is, are there resources that you're providing? Are there stories that you're telling to organizations that either are affiliated with Google or vendors or retail businesses that just need a nudge or just need the right story?
Well, you know better than I do that, especially when you're in the real estate business and leasing, it's all about momentum and storytelling.
Yeah.
And so the two stories that are powerful right now are, of course, Google making that bet. And they're making that bet on the largest transit hub in the city.
Yeah.
But they're making that bet because we were the number one market for employee demand within the Google network when they had a flexible work policy. People wanted to live in Chicago.
Interesting.
So you think about what they were able to do in Fulton Market and the kind of stone in the water and the ripple effects.
Yeah.
That's going to happen on LaSalle, combined with the fact that now you're seeing, billions of dollars of interest on that corridor and huge levels of focus from the city. So I think that's a pretty easy story to tell. The story that's not often told that I think is very important for our listeners here is the story of Discover in Chatham. And so this is a facility that was a closed big box retail store that ripped the heart out of a community in Chatham, 87th and Cottage Grove. And during the height of COVID, the CEO of Discover Financial said, I can bring a call center anywhere in the world, and we have huge demand now because of the pandemic. I want to put this call center to take care of our customers on the south side because I understand that we need to create more jobs there. So Roger, the CEO of Discover, took over this facility. They rebuilt it. It's spectacular. It's just beautiful on the inside. And they already have 400 people working there. 90% of them are from a 5-mile radius.
Amazing.
It's their number one performing center in the entire country.
Wow.
And it tells you that actually doing business on the south and the west side is good for business. This is not philanthropy. And so these dual stories of prosperity, thriving downtown with Google expansion, Kellogg moving their headquarters, combined with, really interesting new attention that's never been at this level for decades on the south and the west side. This is what the future of Chicago needs. And I'm really encouraged by the momentum that we've seen, despite the pandemic.
I love that, which feeds right into the narrative of a strong downtown supported by neighborhoods. How different, in your mind, does the city look when hybrid is so pervasive as to make the neighborhood coffee shop the new company cafe and further distribute the talent from a single highly concentrated core in the CBD to sort of fanning out across the different neighborhoods?
So this is a good question. I mean, what we've seen effectively from COVID is some sort of shift in the value of properties where, I heard a bank CEO say this recently, is, we've taken our commercial real estate operations and moved them into your living room.
Yeah.
And, that's probably not the most sustainable thing long term.
Right.
So I anticipate a higher demand for third spaces in neighborhoods. And so for the people who are able to work remotely, those Mondays or Fridays where they might be at home for whatever reason, they're not always going to actually be at home. Mm-hmm. And we've seen a lot of increased demand in neighborhood businesses through the pandemic. And what that means is we're seeing a heightened amount of activity of these co-working amenities with, maybe it's a coffee shop, maybe it's a restaurant, maybe it's a club. But the example I'll give you is WeWork is opening an outpost in Uptown. Pre-pandemic, I never would have thought that would have happened. And Uptown's a beautifully diverse community, diverse income levels, diverse race and ethnicity groups. So it's fascinating to see WeWork do that and make that move. And we've given 160 real estate development grants out last year for over $120 million of funds from us, moving about $250 million of development just on small neighborhood-based projects. Wow. And this is addressing exactly what you're saying, is this demand for amenities is pretty strong.
Recently, news came out about H-1B Connect, which I found, as an immigrant myself, I found that to be a fascinating and really promising program. Talk a little bit about that and its potential impact.
Well, look, we share these immigrant roots. This country was built on immigration, and Chicago has consistently been voted the number one most welcoming city to immigrants. And that is so important to Mayor Lightfoot and our entire team, because ultimately to increase the population of the city, to have economic growth, to have thriving neighborhoods, immigration is key to that.
Yep.
We actually have the 5th largest Mexican city in the world of Mexican nationals. Most folks don't know that. And we're very proud of our Mexican and Mexican-American communities that are here in Chicago. So this H-1B program, this hits me deeply because a lot of people don't realize that in America, we have the best education system in the world. We educate, tens of thousands of, talented people. And then if they can't get a visa or a job, that they get basically deported to their home countries to go take their talent there.
Yeah.
And it's a really crazy system when you think about it. And I had experience hiring people on H-1Bs at my own startup, and it's really tough to get these visas. So for people who aren't aware, an H-1B, if you are a new worker in America, you get this visa, and it's tied to your employer. But it allows you to stay in America, and it's the first step to getting a green card that then is the next step towards trying to become a citizen. And during the tech layoffs right now, many of these workers who are foreign-born are on H-1B visas. And so our team at World Business Chicago, partnered with P33 and other civic organizations, came up with this idea to say, well, many of these folks who are losing their jobs have 60 days to find a new place of employment, or they're going to lose their immigration status. And we'll lose them from our city, and we'll lose them from our country. And think about the impact that your family or my family's had on this country. Yeah. We can't lose these people. And so they have staged this national campaign with major employers who are willing to sponsor these employees to say, okay, great, we would love to hire you and bring your talent to our company so we can keep you in Chicago and we can keep you in America. And in many instances, this could also mean people who are moving to Chicago to come here for jobs. So I think it's vitally important. It was something that got a lot of attention for the city, and we want to remain the number one city for immigration. It's key to our future economic growth.
So, I mean, with all the tech layoffs that have been happening, it's literally a goldmine, over 100,000 people, and a good chunk of those, I'm sure, are on H-1Bs. At the same time, though, there are not a lot of companies that are hiring aggressively. So what's the sort of initial data looking like around the success of that program?
Well, it recently launched, but the data point I'll give you is in the Chicago metropolitan area, we have 10 million people, and there's over 400,000 vacant jobs. So there is opportunity out there, 400,000 vacant jobs. So what we have to work on is matchmaking and making sure that we're promoting this ecosystem because the demand is there.
I like that. So I was talking with a developer friend of mine recently, and he had a question that I'd love your take on. So Chicago...
Is this when I get asked about taxes?
Yes.
Oh, see, and when anyone says they have a developer friend and they have a question, but it's anonymous, it's usually about taxes.
There's probably something to it then. So so Chicago has one of the highest commercial property effective tax rates in the country. And with almost all leases structured as net leases, which is, as you know, when taxes and operating expenses just get passed through onto the tenants, this, all else being equal, puts the city at a little bit of a disadvantage to other cities. Again, all else being equal. So how can the city mitigate this to sort of stem the impact on companies that are already under pressure to get their costs under control?
Well, I think there's three things that are important in this conversation. The first is there is a massive wave of reform happening on real estate appraisals that are tied to taxes as well that the assessor Fritz Kagi is doing. And I know that he hasn't always, been popular in developer circles, but I support what he's doing because he's trying to bring transparency and reform to how we value buildings. Because historically, there's this kind of operation where, the people who are connected get to appeal their taxes, And these law firms get rich off of it, and it's just a whole cycle, and it's just not fair, frankly. And so I applaud Assessor Kagi, who was recently reelected, to carry out that mission. It does matter.
Yep.
The second important thing in this discussion is structural financial reform in the city. And so this is something Mayor Lightfoot's been committed to. It's why we're building a $2 billion casino. And why we've made some very difficult choices to make sure that we are, paying our pension obligations in the right way, why we are, not playing budgetary games anymore. It's so important to have good structural, predictable finances. And it's why we got 10 ratings upgrades in the past few months, and all of the city debt is now investment grade. Wow. So that matters for predictability. But the last piece of this is Chicago's affordable. And so I'm deeply aware of these concerns about the kind of effective tax rate. When you look at the total cost of being a tenant here in Chicago, and I know this from running my startup, it costs me less than half as much to be operating my company here in a life science space, despite that pass-through and the triple net lease, than it would in California, than it would in Boston, than it would in New York. And so, yes, we have a long way to go to make sure we're growing our economy, growing our population base, and reducing that effective tax burden on any one of us as individual businesses or residents. But we have to look, when we pitch Chicago and you just show the total cost of what it's going to cost for you to rent a space, it's less than most cities.
Yeah.
And I think that's ultimately what matters.
It's all about the story, right? As always. So a couple of last questions. If you could think of one or two lessons that you learned from the city's response to COVID, what would those be?
I think the top lesson for me was the value and necessity of deepened collaboration between the public sector, private sector, and nonprofit sector. I always try to build myself as a tri-sector leader. I've worked in each of these sectors, but never did we understand the interconnectivity and vitality of that interconnectivity than during COVID. Between the hospitals working together, with the government, with private industry. I mean, everybody was connected.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, to solve a big challenge like COVID, that learning we need to apply to solving the big challenges of our era: poverty, inequality, segregation. Those are the challenges that if we solve, not only will we grow the population, we will be a safer, more thriving, more equitable city. And so taking that collaboration from these three sectors and applying them to the future to solve these endemic structural challenges that we face, it's something that I think we've built some muscle on, and now we need to continue to hit the gym to solve these problems.
No, I like the analogy. I think it's ensuring that those initiatives stay squarely in the important and urgent quadrant.
Exactly.
Right? Because COVID was easy to bill as incredibly urgent and incredibly important. I think that's the biggest thing to keep in mind going forward.
And let me just double down on this. A lot of companies made a lot of commitments coming after the murder of George Floyd. It saddens me a little bit that there's been less of a focus on those core issues, that we cannot forget what, everyone went through during that period and the need for fundamental change. But also, there is no country in the history of the world that has a level of inequality that we have in America that has resolved it peacefully. So for me, inequality is fundamentally bad for business, and it is incumbent on all of us to try and tackle it. It's not just a problem for government. It's not just something to hand to philanthropy. And you can't just say it's only for business. All three have to do it, but the key is all three have to recognize this as a problem and actually be purposeful in how they solve it.
Recognizing that it's actually an urgent problem, but that may not seem as urgent.
Exactly.
So last question. If you were to give a closing statement in making a case for companies that are considering Chicago, what would you say to summarize it?
Chicago is an absolutely special place. It let me build the life that I have. It's given me everything I have professionally. It's a city that lets me be who I want to be. And whether you're building a company, whether you want to work in community, whether you want to live in an affordable, diverse neighborhood, whether you want to have access to all the arts and culture amenities of a great global city, you can find everything you will need in this city, and you can be welcomed and you can afford to be here. And there's no greater city in the world, from my opinion, because of that. And certainly we have a lot to work on, but I'll be here. And I've chosen to grow my company here. I've chosen to serve, in the public sector for a reason. It's because I'm bullish on the city's future. And so companies that are in the know, they pick Chicago. And it's why in our startup ecosystem, people who invest in Chicago have the highest ROI of any fund. So I would just follow the math.
The prosecution rests, Your Honor. Samir Mayekar, Deputy Mayor, City of Chicago, thank you for sharing your wisdom, being on the show.
Thanks, Max, so much. I appreciate what you're doing, and I'll look forward to doing this again sometime.
Thanks a lot, man.